This will be a story that will give you goosebumps. Imagine an ordinary sunny day in the park, where people are enjoying walks and moments of happiness. Suddenly a sharp sound is heard. It's a camera falling, broken into thousands of shards. It was smashed by a man full of hatred, but it was not enough for him. He hit a girl, a black girl. However, he had no idea that his act would be the beginning of his own nightmare when he found out who her father was. Right now, while you're watching this video, put your name and the city you're watching us from in the comments. It's so important to us. Every comment and like helps our channel grow. Tell more stories and do us justice. Thank you for your support. You are our motivation to keep moving forward. Enjoy the show. Lakeview Park was bathed in the golden light of the morning sun. The warm summer day attracted many families, couples and friends, filling the paths with the sound of laughter, children's cries and the sounds of guitar playing nearby. The place was idyllic, a tranquility that is rarely disturbed in such places. On one of the green lawns Saturday, Leah, a 17-year-old girl with a bright smile, genuinely enjoying the moment. Her thick black hair was braided into neat pigtails, and she was holding her favorite camera, given by her father on her last birthday. It was her passion to capture the beauty of everyday life, to capture the laughter of children, the sparkling drops of water from the fountain, the occasional smiles of passersby. Next to Leah Saturday, her best friend Sarah, a cheerful blonde with blue eyes who always knew how to cheer up. That day they decided to make a small photo album. One summer day, as Leah called it, not far from them, Sarah's family, her parents, Emma and George, and her younger brother, Tommy, were on the picnic blanket. He tried to blow bubbles, occasionally running up to Leah to show her how big his bubbles were. Leah got up from her seat and walked toward the fountain, where the light played highlights on the water. She raised her camera to take a picture of the boy who was splashing happily. Everything was perfect. It seemed like this day would be remembered forever. But somewhere behind her back, a threat was beginning to brew. There was a man sitting on a bench nearby. His name was Richard Grayson. He had a stern face, a disgruntled look, and clothes that emphasized his gloom. He looked at Leah with irritation, his fingers nervously rubbing the newspaper. Every time she raised her camera to take a picture, his brow furrowed more and more. Richard saw the world differently. For him, people like Leah shouldn't be here, enjoying life, mixing with others. And with each passing second, his irritation grew. Leah, unsuspecting, turned to her friend and, laughing, showed her the picture she had taken. That laughter was the last straw for Richard. The calm of a perfect day had been broken. The beginning of the storm was inexorably close. Richard Grayson stood up from the bench, leaning heavily on his cane. He was in his 50s, but his movements were full not of age but of rage, as if his every movement were dictated by accumulated hatred. His face was harsh, with deep wrinkles, as if they captured a lifetime of anger and resentment toward the world. The slight stubble on his chin made his appearance even more severe, and his cold gray eyes burned through everything he looked at. He crossed his arms over his chest and stopped a few feet away from Leah. Richard watched her carefree smile, the way she laughed with her friend and discussed something, and everything inside him boiled. His hatred for her, the stranger, had no logical explanation. Her simple existence, her happiness, irritated him as if it were a personal grudge. Here they are, he muttered under his breath, so that no one would hear. They came here as if they owned it all. His hand tensed for a moment, and the newspaper he was clutching crumbled under the pressure of his fingers. When he looked around, he noticed that no one was paying attention to him. Everyone was still enjoying the day, absorbed in their joy. This picture only increased his irritation. Richard moved forward, striding heavily. His boots hit the gravel of the path with a loud thud, causing Leah to turn around. Her cheerful expression had changed to one of slight weariness, but she was still smiling, thinking that perhaps the man had something to ask. "Hey!" Richard sharply called out to her, his voice rough, filled with contempt. Leah frowned. Something in his tone made her inwardly tense. He didn't look like someone who just wanted to ask a question or ask for help. His gaze, that cold, hard stare, was like a knife edge aimed straight at her. "Do you think you can walk around here like masters?" he said, not hiding his hostility. His words were soaked with venom, each one cutting the air. Leah was confused, not knowing what to say. Sarah stepped closer, feeling the tension in the air become almost palpable. "I'm sorry. What are you talking about?" Leah finally answered, trying to speak calmly, but her voice shook slightly. You know exactly what I mean, he growled, taking a step closer. He stood so close now that Leah could smell the tobacco and old sweat coming off him. Sarah intervened decisively. We don't know you. Why don't you just go your own way? But Richard paid no attention to her. His cold eyes were fixed only on Leah, as if she were guilty of some crime he could not forgive. Do you have the camera? He said suddenly. Do you think you have the right to take pictures here? To take pictures of us normal people? The words normal people sounded especially evil. His tone grew more and more threatening, and his body tensed, as if he were preparing for something. Leah looked at Sarah, her heart beating faster than usual. Her instincts were screaming that something bad was about to happen, but she hadn't yet realized how right her feelings were. I'm talking to you, Richard bellowed so loudly that several people in the park turned around, but no one made a move toward him. Leah clutched the camera to her chest, her fingers gripping the belt tightly, as if it would protect her from what was happening. She took a step back, trying to keep her distance, but Richard moved after her, his movements sharp and aggressive. Get it here! He grabbed the camera strap with a jerk, and Leah felt her shoulder jerk forward from his strength. What are you doing? She shrieked, her voice trailing off in fear. Sarah tried to intervene, stepping between Leah and Richard, but he pushed her away without thinking. Her friend flew aside, falling to the grass, and Francie, dumbfounded by his rudeness. That's my thing. Let go. Leah clung to the belt as hard as she could, but Richard was much stronger, his face contorted in a grimace of rage. That look of hatred spoke more than words. For him, Leah was not a person, but an object to express all the anger he had stored up. All you do is spoil everything. You meddle where you don't belong, he yelped, and with another yank of his belt, he snatched the camera out of her hands. Leah lost her balance and fell to her knees, but her gaze was fixed on Richard. He held her camera like a trophy, and then, with contempt and a gloating grin, raised it over his head. That's what I think of you and your toys, he hissed and threw the camera to the ground with force. There was a deafening crack so loud that it seemed to drown out all the sounds of the park for a moment. The lens shattered, the camera body deformed, and the debris scattered like shards of glass. Leah Saturday on the ground, stunned, her hands trembled, her lips whispered something inaudible, but her eyes were fixed on the broken camera, her dream, her favorite thing, her work. You had no right, she finally cried out, her voice full of despair and pain. Richard stepped closer, his shadow falling over Leah, making him look even more sinister. I have a right to everything, he shouted. You and yours shouldn't be here at all. He was about to say something again, but his words were drowned out by Leah's first tears. She couldn't hold back any longer, and that seemed to fuel his rage. Are you crying? He grinned evilly. Have you had enough? Then maybe you'll realize who's in charge. No one in the park ever approached. Some turned away, pretending that nothing was happening. Others just watched from a distance, hesitant to interface. The atmosphere was saturated with fear and tension. But that wasn't all. Leah didn't know what he was going to do next, but his gaze was clear. He wasn't going to stop. Leah rose to her feet, her knees trembling, but she struggled to keep her balance. Her eyes were full of tears, but not from pain or resentment. It was a mixture of fear and rage. The broken camera lay at her feet, like a mute witness to the brutality. Richard, however, wasn't going to stop. His face contorted into a gloating grin, and his voice cut through the air like a cold blade. That's typical of you, he began, his words filled with contempt. You go where you're not wanted. You think just because you picked up a camera, you're someone important. No, girl, you always stay where you are. Leah stared at him silently, her breathing quickening, her throat constricted, the words stuck inside, as if fear consumed her completely. You think you're our equal? He continued, coming closer. His voice was lower, quieter, but that made it sound even scarier. You think you can walk here, in our park, take pictures of us, live among us? He took a step forward, and Leah instinctively drew back, but her back was against the tree trunk. He seemed to enjoy it. Tell me, girl, his tone became mocking, almost hissing. Where would you be if it weren't for your endless privileges? If you weren't given everything on a platter? People like you don't deserve what you have. Shut up, Sarah shouted suddenly, getting up off the ground and standing next to Leah. Her voice shook, but she was ready to defend her friend. You have no right to talk to her like that. Richard shifted his gaze to Sarah, grinned, but then turned back to Leah, completely ignoring the girl's words. Oh, she brought her friends here to help, too. He laughed mockingly, but even they couldn't hide the truth. He squinted, tilting his head sideways. His voice became icy, as if every word was poisoned with hatred. You'll always be dirt, he said, and no matter how much you try to appear better, we'll always see what you really are. Every word he said broke the silence of the park, making those watching from afar look away even more. Someone tried to record what was happening on his phone, but no one dared to come closer. Oi, who are we? Leah finally found her voice. Her hands clenched into fists, her fear mixed with anger, but her voice still sounded hoarse. Richard smirked, leaning closer so that their faces were only a few centimeters apart. Real people, he hissed, and you're just a reminder of how low society can fall. The words hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating weight. Leah felt the ground slipping from under her feet. She never encountered such open contempt, such hatred. For a moment she thought she heard her own heartbeat, so loud it drowned out everything around her. But it was only a brief moment of silence before Richard took another step, an even more threatening one. Remember this day, girl, he said, because it will show you where you belong. Richard stood so close to Leah that she could feel his hot, panting breath. His eyes burned with rage, and his fists were clenched so white, his knuckles turned white. It didn't seem human at that moment, but the embodiment of pure anger about to burst forth. Leah tried to hold on, but her body clenched instinctively, her fingers gripping the strap of the bag tightly, as if it could be any defense. Her breathing became ragged, and she could feel the fear gripping her despite her attempts to stay strong. Sarah tried to intervene again. She sprang toward Richard, arms outstretched to stop him. You're crazy. Leave her alone. But Richard shoved her sharply aside. Sarah fell to the ground again, shrieking fearfully. There was no obstacle between him and Leah now. You don't even deserve to be spoken to, he growled, raising his hand. His fist swung high over her head. This is so you realize you don't belong here. The crowd watching held its breath. No one moved. No one tried to interface. Only the tense rustling of the wind in the trees and the splashing of the water in the fountain could be heard. The people frownsy, as if chained by fear or indifference. Richard threw a punch. His fist collided with Leah with a loud clap. The force of the blow knocked her to the ground, and she crumbled to the hard gravel. Her head spun, and for a moment the world before her eyes became blurry. Pain coursed through her body, but worse than the physical pain was the pain of humiliation. She heard Sarah scream her name, but she couldn't move. Richard didn't move. His breathing was heavy, but there was no regret in his eyes, only triumph. He looked around, as if he wanted to show everyone that he was in charge, that he could do whatever he wanted. The crowd continued to watch as if it were a spectacle, but concern appeared on the faces of some. Someone whispered, "This is too much. Someone should call the police," said the woman standing by the bench. But no one pulled out a phone. The fear that their intervention would also make them a target paralyzed everyone. Leah, lying on the ground, heard Richard say, throwing the words back down like trash. "There, girl, now you know where you belong." His voice was full of cold, indifferent contempt. He turned and started to walk away, leaving Leah lying on the ground, broken and humiliated. But this wasn't the end of it. The shadow of his actions had already begun to move in his direction, ready to destroy his triumph. The park frownsy, as if time had stopped. Everyone who saw Leah fall felt like a spectator in a nightmare play, but no one moved. No one dared take a step forward. Leah lay on the ground, her palm pressed against her cheek where the blow had struck. The gravel scratched her skin, and a sharp pain shot through her body, but her soul ached even more, the humiliation and injustice eating at her from the inside out. She couldn't hold back the tears. They flowed on their own, hot and salty, and ran down her cheeks, leaving a bitter taste of defeat. Sarah crawled up to Leah on her knees, her face awestruck. She hugged her friend, whispering, "It's gonna be okay. I'm here. I'm with you." But her words sounded hollow. Even she didn't believe in them. Richard, standing a little farther away, showed no sign of remorse. His face remained cold and indifferent, as if he'd just solved some minor problem. He slowly wiped his palm on his jeans, as if he wanted to erase the very fact of contact. His gaze slid over the people gathered, a look of defiance in his eyes. "What? "Do any of you have something to say?" he asked in a loud, mocking voice, looking around the crowd. People didn't move. Some lowered their eyes. Others pretended to look at their phones. A man standing with his wife and child said in a whisper, "Don't get involved. Let's just go." The elderly couple on the bench exchanged worried glances, but did not move. The woman with the dog whispered, "It's awful, but it's none of our business." Even those who tried to record what was happening held their phones low, afraid the aggressor would notice. The cameras captured the brutality, but the hands that held them were shaking with fear. Richard grinned, his thin lips curving into a contemptuous smirk. "That's it. No one will say anything. No one will do anything," he said, turning to the crowd. "Because you know I'm right." These words sounded like a spit in the face of everyone present, but they remained silent. Cowardice and fear bound them more tightly than chains. "I wrote it all down," whispered a girl in her 20s. Standing off to the side, she held the phone out of sight, but when her companion gave her a concerned look, she added, "Although, maybe it's not worth putting it out there. What if he finds out who took the pictures?" Meanwhile, Leah, still lying on the ground, sobbed quietly, almost silently. Her little world had been shattered, her faith in justice and in someone coming to help her shaken. "Why?" she whispered, barely audible. Sarah squeezed her hand tighter, her own eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. Leah, I don't know." Richard cast one last glance at them, as if at the trash he was scornfully leaving behind, and turned, heading away. His gait was calm, as if he'd just finished something mundane, something not worth thinking about. But the tension in the park remained. It did not dissipate, even after he disappeared behind the trees. People still stood motionless, stunned, with a guilt they couldn't admit to themselves. Someone finally took a step, then another, and people began to slowly disperse, trying to get away from the scene. Leah remained lying on the ground, as if it were her only way to keep from collapsing. Richard walked along the sidewalk of the park, feeling a familiar satisfaction inside. It seemed to him that he had shown everyone his superiority, had put the superfluous in their place. His steps were confident and his head was proudly raised. He did not look back, not even thinking about the consequences. Deep inside, however, something was beginning to stir. It was a slight uneasiness he couldn't yet name. The crowd in the park didn't make a peep at him, but their looks, they were full of judgment. It was beginning to irritate him. Weak, pathetic hypocrites, he thought. None of them even made a peep, but they'll be whispering behind their backs. Nothing. It won't help them. He was about to get into his car, parked at the park exit, when he noticed a tall man approaching him. At first glance, nothing special: athletic build, streaked suit, dark glasses, but something in his gait and posture made Richard instinctively tense. "Are you Richard Harper?" the man asked in a low, husky voice, stopping only a few paces away. Richard frowned. "Who's asking?" The man slowly removed his glasses, revealing the piercing gaze of dark eyes. His face was hard, with chiseled features, and every wrinkle seemed carved with a sculptor's chisel. "My name is Marcus Jameson," he said. Richard frowned slightly. The name seemed familiar, but he couldn't immediately remember where he'd heard it. "Oh, what do you want?" he asked gruffly, hiding his growing awkwardness behind his usual abruptness. Marcus took a step closer, and Richard felt the air around them thicken. From this distance, he could see a small badge on the lapel of Marcus's jacket, the emblem of a law firm. "You just attacked my daughter," Marcus said, his voice flat but with a cold strength. Richard frowned. His heart skipped a beat, and his insides clenched as if he suddenly had no room to breathe. "Your daughter," he muttered, taking a step back. Marcus nodded, his eyes never straying from Richard's face, as if he were standing it, seeing through it all. "Yes, my daughter, Leah Jameson, the girl you raised your hand to." The name echoed in Richard's head. Now he remembered where he had heard the name. Marcus Jameson was a famous lawyer, a man who had won the most difficult cases, including against people with racist views like Richard. His name was in the headlines, associated with truth and unrelenting justice. I didn't know," Richard mumbled, backing away another step. Marcus didn't move, but his presence felt like a pressing wall. "And if you knew?" His voice was quiet, but cold as ice. "Would it have made a difference?" Richard tried to justify himself, but the words stuck in his throat. He felt a wave of fear rising in him, turning his confidence into nothing. The man in front of him was more than just his father. He was a man of influence, power, and impeccable reputation. "Look, this is all a misunderstanding," Richard began, but Marcus raised his hand sharply, silencing him. "Misunderstanding?" he interjected, his voice harder. "Is that what you call humiliating and abusing my daughter?" Richard tried to say something, but he couldn't find the words. For the first time, he felt his world begin to crack. The man he just tried to humiliate was not just a father, but someone who could turn his life upside down. Richard stood as if paralyzed. His gaze jumped from Marcus's face to his hand, which he still held in the air. His mind was a jumble of horror, shame, and confusion. Everything that had seemed controllable and certain to him at that moment began to crumble. Marcus Jameson was more than just a successful lawyer. He was a giant in his field, a man who could destroy the reputation and career of anyone in his sights with a single word. In a world ruled by money and connections, Jameson's name was one of the most respected and powerful. "I think you realize who you're dealing with," Marcus continued, his voice even firmer. He stepped forward slowly, and Richard felt the pressure building in his chest, as if this man could squeeze his heart with a single glance. Richard tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He felt the moment take on its full weight. Marcus, without waiting for a reply, continued, "I'm the man who can make your life a living hell. With one phone call, one signature, I can take everything from you." He almost hissed. "Your money, your possessions, your relationships with your co-workers, all of your connections that you have so carefully built could disappear. Everything you have will be destroyed." His eyes glittered like knives. It was as if he saw through what was left of Richard and realized that he was nothing. Richard, despite his outward confidence, was fragile and empty, standing in front of real power. "I'm not going to wait for you to start apologizing," Marcus said, his voice flat, almost monotone, "because it won't do my daughter any justice. One question is important to me. How are you going to pay for what you've done?" Richard clenched his fists. He knew he wouldn't be treated so easily. He could try to justify himself or beg forgiveness, but it would be useless. There was no room for pity in Marcus's eyes. "You destroyed my daughter," Marcus continued, ignoring Richard's confusion, "and I promise that she will be protected. To the last. My home, my resource, they're all for her. If you need to understand the price you'll have to pay, you'll just see it. You will realize that your attempts to escape punishment will be futile." Richard tried to swallow, his throat dry. He realized that he had been wrong, that his actions had been not just unwise, but disastrous. But it was too late. Marcus wasn't just a father. He was a powerful player who could ruin his life in a second. "Understand one thing, Richard," Marcus continued, his eyes now cold and determined. "All your attempts at evasion, all your petty efforts to justify yourself, are not something I am going to accept. I will not tolerate the slightest hint of a repeat of what happened today." At that moment, Richard realized that he had lost. He felt something unexpected happening to him, something in his body breaking, his confidence disappearing, replaced by a threat he couldn't avoid. "I understand," Richard said quietly, struggling to get the words out. He no longer knew how to fight, how to defend at least his honor. He stood before this power, before the man who could destroy him, and realized that now he had nothing left but humility. Marcus nodded, his face still impassive. He stepped back, ignoring Richard, who stood as if in a stupor, then drew conclusions. "Richard," he said, "and remember, the price of hate is always high, and what you gave away today will cost you much more." With those words, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing alone, feeling as if his life had been torn apart. That evening, when Richard returned to his empty apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was shrinking around him. Everything that had seemed so stable and sure before now seemed fragile and shaky, like a glass sphere ready to burst at the slightest impact. He couldn't get Marcus's words out of his head. A powerful lawyer, a man who could destroy everything he built with a single move. Richard wasn't stupid, and he realized that one mistake could cost him everything. His career, his reputation, his life, everything was in jeopardy. But what tormented him most deeply was the realization that he had lost more than just something material. He had lost his dignity. And now, in this empty room, his thoughts were spinning like a frenzied dance. Every memory of the time He raised his hand to the girl tormented him, but it wasn't just remorse. It was more a realization of how deep he had sunk into his own poison, how justified he was in his hatred and contempt. Used to viewing the world through the lens of his privilege, now found himself on the edge, not knowing how he could take it all back. His phone vibrated sharply on the table, jolting him out of his gloomy thoughts. The name of his lawyer, James, popped up on the screen. Richard answered it immediately, giving himself no time to think. "Richard, we need to talk," James said. His voice was weary, tinged with anxiety. "About what?" Richard felt his legs give out. It was like a nightmare. "You don't realize what you signed up for," James continued. "I just got a call from Jameson. He gave you an ultimatum." Richard fell silent, his heart pounding. "What does he want?" He whispered. "He wants you to plead guilty, and he wants you to publicly apologize to his daughter," James said. "But that's not all. He warned that if you don't, he's going to take action. Everything you've built could disappear." Richard shook his head, clenching his fists. This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise that Marcus Jameson was willing to fulfill. Richard knew that this man had the power to destroy him, not only through the courts, but in business and in his personal life. "He leaves me no choice," Richard said, realizing that his life would never be the same again. "I recommend that you give it some serious thought, but if you want, I'll help you make a public statement," James offered. Feeling the gravity of the situation, Richard knew that nothing would help. He faced the inevitable consequences: criminal prosecution, possible public shame, and the complete collapse of his reputation. All of these things, which had once seemed distant and unreal to him, now hung over him like a knife's edge. His Saturday down on the couch, losing the last of his strength, his head was all jumbled up, and he couldn't tell the difference between fear and shame. "It's over," Richard thought, but that realization, as it turned out, was not the end, only the beginning of his fall. He pictured Leah's face again, the way she lay on the ground, her cheek bleeding, crying in pain and humiliation. He remembered her eyes, full of fear, and that sense of despair that was so foreign to his own. He realized now that he had ruined not only her life, but his own as well. And even though he had to go through all of this, the condemnation, the public apology, perhaps the legal consequences, there was still an indelible sense of guilt on his face. He looked out the window at the city, engulfed in the glow of the lights, but now those lights seemed as distant and cold as the world he had lost. The world continued to spin, and time, as always, did not stop. But for Richard, everything had changed. He was no longer the man he had been before. He wasn't the confident man who despised those who were not like him. Now all he could feel was the heavy burden that pressed down on him every day. The hatred and prejudice to which he had succumbed, and which he himself had cultivated, had become his own fetters. He could not escape from it. Richard got a chance to take a step back by admitting his mistake. Publicly apologizing to Leah Jameson was just the first step on a long road to redemption. But it wasn't enough to regain what he lost. He realized that, and his fall was a painful reminder that hate always leads to destruction. The recovery process for Richard was a long one. He tried to find a place for himself in a world where his past beliefs had been rejected, where the people they had once socialized with had turned their backs on him. He was now a nobody. Leah, despite all the suffering, went through her journey with dignity. She was strong, determined, and didn't let the situation break her. There was something more than vulnerability in her eyes. It was the realization that strength was not about physical strength or her father's abilities, but about the ability to stand firm despite whatever threatened. Richard's story is a lesson that affected not only him, but everyone who witnessed his downfall. Hate, racism, prejudice all lead to only one result: destruction. Identity, life, and connections, all of his aggression, all of those warped views of the world, have now become his shadow, haunting his steps wherever he goes. The world he lived in was a fragile one. He learned this at a high cost, realizing that hatred destroys not only the one it is directed at, but also the one who carries it. This was the main lesson. Despite all the difficulties and pain, we should be considerate of others, respect their differences, not judge them by their appearance, skin color, or origin. Hate always comes back like a boomerang, and in the end, the victim is the one who sowed it. And now, after a time, Richard looked at the world with different eyes. He realized that restoration is not just a matter of public apologies or correcting mistakes. It is a journey that must be traveled in one's heart, in one's mind, and the sooner one realizes that hate never solves a problem, the sooner one can find the path to redemption and true peace. He wasn't who he was anymore, but he was ready to start over.